Hello and welcome to our webinar today, provided to you by Help Systems. And today's webinar is going to be on the topic of security, specifically for IBM IFS security. Really what we're going to look at is how that you can close the most commonly overlooked security gap on the system. My name's Sandy Moore. I'm a lead solutions engineer here with Help Systems. My role is in primarily security, where I help customers to find the best security solution to meet their needs, the current projects they're working on. I've actually been working on IBM for years now. I'm coming up on 20 years. So, this is really security is a passion for me, and I've worked in many different roles in the software industry on IBM with support, testing, training as well now on that front side with the solutions engineering. So hopefully you'll get some good information out of our webinar today and walk away with some new ideas. All right, so agenda, we're actually going to roll through this here pretty quickly, but make sure that we cover all the ground. What we're really going to be looking at is what the IFS is, how it's configured, what the threats are, talk about some little known vulnerabilities that do leave your files at risk, how malware can be so devastating to the IFS, regulatory concerns, as well as how to audit your IFS activities. So really trying to get the idea across is to understand why the IFS is this big security gap. Of course, before we do that, we have to talk about what the Mysterious IFS is. So I'm sure you've heard it said, you may be familiar with it, but I guarantee there's some things about it that you probably didn't even realize. So the IFS itself is called the integrated file system. And on IBM mid-range or mainframe systems, it's the POSIX compatible file system provided by the operating system, as opposed to the traditional non-POSIX file system it also supplies. So that side is the native programs, the green screen, all of those things we're familiar with. But this POSIX compatible, this is that integrated file system, that Windows style file system that is part of the system. Now, the IFS is actually not new. This has actually was added in 1994 at OS 400 v3r1. So this is not something new. However, the way we use it has definitely changed over time. And really what it provides is it allows us to integrate the IBM with any Unix, Windows, or other platforms. So making it essentially another file server. The directory structure itself is very much like that you would see with a PC, following that nested tree directory structure. And it gives you access to data stored on those integrated servers or on other remote IBM servers. So essentially, you've created an environment with the integrated file system where the IBM is a file server just like that Windows server, just like that Unix server, and they are interchangeable. Now, the integrated file system actually contains several predefined file systems. So everything is contained within that single root directory. We'll be talking a lot about the root directory as we go through the presentation today. And each one of those predefined file systems in the integrated file system or the IFS has its own limitations and rules. And we'll get in depth on some of that as well today. But first, I actually want to kick this off with a poll, really trying to get an idea of what you guys are doing for security on IBM at this point. So kind of curious as to what security controls you have actually implemented in your environment. So, whether you have a robust exit program, an anti-ransomware strategy, if your network team is the one who's in charge of that, are you kind of relying on a wing and a prayer, your users don't know what the IFS is or how they would actually use it. What about someone who doesn't use their IFS? Every once in a while I have someone tell me that. And then, of course, you may have a combination of all of these. And so, that would be other. And I certainly understand where, combinations of security strategies is important and layering is important as well. So, and actually I have to tell you guys, this is actually a trick question, actually a trick answer, that you don't use your IFS. So we'll get into that for sure here in a minute. All right. So poll's been open for a minute. It looks like primarily I'm seeing that users are either have a robust exit program and a ransomware strategy, or they have a combination thereof. So pretty typical. So I'm glad to see you guys are at least paying attention to it. Okay, so what's the Mysterious IFS? Really contrary to popular belief, it's not an add-on. So this is not actually a bolt-on to the existing file structures. It encompasses all of your file structures, and that includes everything that predates the IFS, such as qsys.lib, your actual operating system, the native side of the system, as well as QDLS. So those existed before the IFS was created, but the IFS actually surrounds it, and it is the umbrella that the native libraries actually resides under. Now, that trick answer in my poll there with whether or not you use the IFS, we technically all use the IFS because it does encompass the qsys.lib. But there's also a lot of other common uses of the IFS, including integrated PC servers, net servers, so actually being able to use Windows Explorer to access the IFS through shared directories, CD images for unattended installations. Your Pace applications resides in the IFS, IBMI access, as well as client access and Navigator executables. Those are all stored in the integrated file system as well. Apache HTTP server, Tomcat application server, WebSphere application server. So any web interface you're doing is going to be, there's going to be objects that are stored in the integrated file system, and there's going to be a folder structure that supports that. Domino, as well as digital certificate manager. Essentially, think of it this way. If you have anything that interface with IBMI that you use that has some sort of graphical representation associated with it, it is using the integrated file system. So whether you're intentionally using it or not and saying, I'm going to go out and use the integrated file system or the IFS, you're using it because you've got those interfaces. It is, in fact, a big part of it, non-removable portion of the actual IBMI itself. Now, when it boils down to looking at security for the IFS, there's really actually a couple things that come into play here, and it can get into a bit of a rat's nest and can get complicated very quickly. So I'm going to kind of try to break it down so that you have some better ideas. We're not going to go into super fine detail with this. We do actually have some other webinars that you're welcome to watch on demand that go more in depth on securing the IFS in general. But basically, on IBMI, every object has their data authorities and object authorities. So your data authorities are going to consist of read, add, update, delete, and execute. Object authorities, operation, management, exist, alter, and reference. So those IBMI authorities are typically assigned through IBM supplied templates. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with the use, change, all, and exclude. So those templates are great. And IBM allows us to use those. But when we start looking at the IFS, this is where things kind of start getting a little funky because it doesn't quite work the same with the IFS. There's actually additional security involved. So if we break it down and start looking at the data authorities themselves and the object authorities versus those supplied templates, you can see that there's, seems to be some overlap, and there's definitely some things that don't seem to really make sense when we're talking about the IFS. So data authorities, you've got read, which is required to read the object. Add, update, delete are required to change the object, and then execute is needed to run a program or find a specific object. Those object authorities, you're going to need object operation in order to operate on data within that object. If the object management is needed to move, rename, or work with specific permissions. Object exist is required for deletes, saves, and restores of the object. Object alter is that database authority. Object reference is also tied to that database authority. Now, when we actually look down at the IBM supplied templates, that exclude is going to specifically deny access to that specific object. Use is going to allow the object operation, read and execute. Change adds the object operation as well as all of those data authorities. And then all actually really literally means all. You've got all data and object authorities with that. Under the covers, the IFS objects are still IBM objects and do have those IBMI authorities. Now, those actions still have to meet the requirements set forth by IBM. So if you wanted to delete a stream file, you have to have that object exist authority. And it's an object authority not associated with that RWX and has to actually be granted separately or inherited from the directory. So you've got some little tweaks there too, because now you have to think about what is the directory authority and is that going to apply the object that you're working with. So when we're looking at root, most IBM directories are actually already configured with appropriate security settings. Your vendor and user directories, I don't know. Who knows? That is something that is up for debate. You know, some vendors pay more attention to security on their directories and others kind of leave things wide open, or the solution is to have their profile that your group is a group profile have all object. So a lot of different ways you can tackle it, but I would definitely look at your vendor and user directories to make sure that you have in fact properly secured them. You have to be cautious though. It's easy to over-secure the IFS because of that nested directory structure and some of these unfamiliar security mechanisms with it. You can actually back yourself into a corner and actually cause problems. I personally don't like to cause problems when working on a security project because it gives you some negative attention at the company. So, you know, your boss is saying, work on the security, you break something, nobody can get onto the system. They're not going to really support that project continuing. So you have to be very careful of how you approach making security changes. Make sure you're making notes of what you're doing so you can always backtrack and revert back to the previous setting if there is a problem. So one step at a time, make sure that you know exactly what you did that caused the issue so that you can get out of it. Okay, so IBM I itself ships with the public access default on the IFS to native objects. It's set to start change. The IFS root folder is actually shipped with RWX plus all of those object authorities. So essentially all authority on that IFS root folder. It's definitely something you should investigate, looking at getting that IFS root folder changed so that you don't unfortunately leave that integrated file system wide open with a unfortunate default setting. So one of those things that we talk about with the public authority on IBMI is that there's actually some potential problems with that. That public authority doesn't apply to users with all object authority. So every year, Help Systems does an annual State of IBMI Security Study. And in 2022, this year, most organizations are still basing their security in general on a lack of user knowledge or malicious intent. So we assume our employees don't know what they are doing, they don't know how to get to the system, or they would never do something wrong. So we kind of leave things wide open. In our security study from this last year, we actually found that the average number of users with all object special authority on the system increased. That was the first time we've seen that actually go up. And it's actually kind of scary because all object authority trumps any object level authorities that you have set. So literally those all object users are able to do anything they want on the system without being stopped. Coupled with that is our user access tends to be a little bit lax when we start looking at passwords. We actually also found that there's an average of 79 enabled profiles on systems that we evaluated that had default passwords. So user ID and password is the same. This is definitely a concern. If you've got, combined IFS security wide open or user with all object authority and a default password, that's left a significant hole in the initial one thing that you could stop users from getting onto the system to do something inappropriate. So definitely something that needs to be circled back to and discussed. The other concern, of course, is how well do you know your coworkers, your employees, your colleagues, your boss? A lot of people have skeletons in their closet. They have things that have happened that they don't want others to know about that may actually come back and be a motivation to do something inappropriate. Financial issues can push people to do things that they would not normally do. Risk of losing your home, risk of you losing your family. You may be willing to actually cross a line that you would never thought you would ever do. In addition, you've got vices that may actually influence someone's ethics being compromised. So, gambling and drugs can definitely start playing with somebody's mindset. And of course, people can make legitimate mistakes. So when users have too much access, any of those things can actually become the reason that the system is compromised. Now, threats to the IFS, the other threats besides your employees and the lack of security is, of course, unfortunately, malware. So when I talk about malware, I'm talking about all of it. Malware is essentially boils down to malicious software, something that's doing something on a server, on a system that is malicious, that has malicious intent. So viruses, worms, Trojan horse programs, ransomware, those are all malware. I use malware and viruses interchangeably. It encompasses all of those malicious attacks. Primarily, ransomware is the one that we're seeing the most. However, there are other types of viruses out there that are still running and still impacting customer systems. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. So other threats to the integrated file system, and really we have to look at how malware can actually spread to the IBMI. So malware itself should not be able, it's not be able to run in the native side. So the integrated file system is really that entry point to the system where malware can actually spread. So discoverable IFS shares. So if you have shares over your IFS, they should not be discoverable. If they are, they're vulnerable on the network. So any of those shares are potentially compromised. Couple that with users with too much authority and default passwords, those shares can very easily be compromised. FTP, another way that the malware can spread to IBMI. It's simply a matter of whether you're working with Windows Office product, such as Word, doing a save as and saving out to an FTP server, or the well-known DOS command window and just typing in those FTP commands. Very easy to populate something up to the system. And very often you have no idea who's using that interface. And malware can very easily be populated to the system. Some other ways the malware can spread to IBMI: image catalogs, NFS mounts, UDFS mounts, business partners, CDs, any way that you're installing something on IBMI where you have taken files that are from another source and put them onto your IBMI. And as I mentioned, if you're using any applications that have any graphical interfaces, that's going to come with files that are going to be populated out to that IFS. So you really have to think about who you're getting files from, what the source is, and are you assuming that they are watching for malware in their files that they're providing to you? And then at that point, decide what your risk is with that as well. Now, high availability, we rely on that in order for the system to be available at a moment's notice if something happens to our production server. Unfortunately, high availability is not very good at managing malware. Unfortunately, it is perfectly happy to replicate malware from your production system to your HA system. So it now then will reside on that HA system. Whether or not you clean it up on production, it may or may not actually be removed on that HA system. So when you roll over, you're rolling over to a server that is in just as bad a shape as the one that you started with. Backup media as well. If you're doing backups of your system, which I assume you all are, you have to consider that if you're saving everything on your system and you've got malware on it, you've saved that malware as well. So when you go to restore to recover from whatever's happened, you've now restored that same malware back onto your server. There's always been some question as to whether or not IBMI can actually either be the source of a virus problem in your network or if it can be impacted by it. So unfortunately, it's not immune to the virus threat. It actually is quite happy to spread viruses out to your users. So all of those ways we talked about already for how malware can spread to the IBMI, it's the other direction as well. So it can perfectly spread malware out to the end users through those map drives. If somebody FTPs files off of your system, you may be sharing out malware to one of your business partners or one of your customers or vendors. The image catalogs, NFS mounts, those are all, again, going to be just another way that not only can IBMI get malware from those sources, but it can also spread that way as well. If you've got an NFS mount and you're seeing another server that's just a drive, it's very easy to populate that from that server off to the new one. And again, high availability spreads it as well as that backup media. So really need to think about how are you populating your files, but then once you think about that, okay, now where are files going? And do we know what we're sending off of our system? Access client solutions or client access is another way. Again, going back to that thought of if we have a graphical interface, we're using the integrated file system. If something within that graphical interface in the IFS is infected, how can it impact your users? So with the client access, especially if you're using the older client access, you have to be very cognizant of the fact that not only is that application vulnerable to viruses and being corrupted, but how many users access it. I actually had a customer who worked, who had client access where their setup file, when they launched client access every morning, one particular user, every time that user launched their green screen in the morning when they started their day, the virus launched on their PC. And they went around for weeks trying to figure out, because every time that virus launched on her PC, they'd go and they'd clean it up, they get her going again. The next day it would happen again. They finally realized that client access had actually been corrupted and was spreading malware within their network. You would never think that in a green screen environment that a virus would be populated that way, but in fact it was. So circling back to web servers, it is, very common for some sort of web service to be running on IBMI, whether it's a web service that is hosting your web user interface for your application, or it's your web server that is customer facing. It can very happily spread viruses as well. I had a customer recently who had a web server that had a Trojan horse program on it that was actually designed to redirect ad traffic. Now, when we discovered this, he said, it's been out there for 9 years. And unfortunately, it had been working for 9 years. So even if that malware has been identified by virus scanning tools, if you haven't neutralized it, it's still working and it's still a problem. So you certainly would never want to serve up malware on your web servers for your users or your customers or your employees. And of course, all of those things, it is absolutely possible for IBMI to spread viruses. It has been a big part of that, and until the specific measures are taken to stop that, it can continue. Really, the little known vulnerabilities in the map drives, and a lot of people say, well, we don't actually have users map drives. If they have the ability to, unfortunately, that is enough. With those map drives, it's just a simple act of doing a right click on your this PC in Windows Explorer and then mapping that drive to that share. So whatever those share names are called, there's an assumption that that share name is really what it's going to. And I will caution you, I've had customers who have had 2 shares of the root directory with different names. So they didn't think they had root shared, but somebody had just named it something else, not root. So never assume what those shares are for. You need to confirm it. Now, the reason I'm concerned with these map drives is if you have, in fact, allowed for mapping to the root directory, especially, you've got easy access to the system. So now you've gone from my users have access to their folders on the IFS, to now you've got users that actually have access to things like QIBM. So we were talking about ACS, or Access Client Solutions, and where do those files come from? They come from the IFS. So QIBM directory can, in fact, very easily be compromised. When we look at that, you can see the ACS base application. But what happens if you have that shared? Let's say it's a simple command, a net use command, map it to specific drive to that share, and then you copy a file. If that user has the authority to put a file on the system in that directory, anything can be copied up there, including a virus. So making sure that you know where your users are able to put things and making sure that they're not putting them out onto the server. You can see here, this is a very easy way to, in fact, replace with that little Y flag there on that copy command, replace that program with something else. This is really where, it's a really good reason to have exit programs. So exit programs actually are tied to an exit point, which enables a process to be temporarily interrupted by a user-written program. Essentially, what you're saying is you're putting in a stop. When that user, or that person posing as a user, attempts to connect to your system, the exit program can halt that. And when they get to that doorway to come in, check to see if in fact you want them to be able to enter the system through that back door. I really call the exit points back doors to the system. Green screen's your front door. All of these PC interfaces are your back doors. So by having an exit program in place, you can monitor the traffic for FTP, ODBC, the integrated file system, so the file server itself. So if that user does have a map drive, you can see exactly what they're doing. Unfortunately, when IBM added all these exit points, or these entry points to the system, they didn't put any built-in auditing or controls with it. So essentially, if your user has a user ID and password and you have secured the IFS, there's that potential that someone's going to be able to get in and do things that you never would have planned for them to do. I would strongly consider implementing exit programs so that you can start auditing and control those actions against the IFS. So being able to see who's connecting through FTP. I can tell you right now, most of your users have no business using FTP. So making sure you're restricting that access. ODBC, sending a command up to the system. Map drives. Is the user allowed to be able to delete stream files through that map drive? Maybe we don't. With the IFS exit point, you're really going to have easy to interpret interrogation, but also supplemental control of that user activity. So what that means is that you're going to be able to put an additional layer of control. So you might have a wide open IFS, actual security object authorities. But with an exit program, you can change that and you can actually start restricting access. So even if you're just actually initially monitoring the traffic to see who's connecting, what are they trying to get to? Are they creating files or directories? Are they deleting files or directories? What in fact is that user doing? So you'll actually be able to keep track of each of those functions that's being performed. Not only that, but with specific exit program, you can actually monitor for the encryption of a file. So think about ransomware. How does that happen? It happens because the user has the ability to rename and delete a file and change a file. So watching for that activity is critical. Cool thing with exit programs is that it actually works against your all object users. You give users access to be able to do things. You can't make the system an island, but how do you make sure that they don't use one of the back doors to affect more damage to the system or damage the system at all? Really, being able to have that control is crucial. So here's an example of being able to record user activities connecting to the IFS with an exit program. This is from our PowerTech Exit Point Manager, and it shows when a user has, in this case, my example shows me being rejected from specific activities. So rejecting me from actually being able to list out all the files in QIBM directory for ACS, or rejecting me from being able to access the home directory or the HR directory, explicitly denying access for a specific user. But of course, if you don't know what users are doing, you have to monitor that for a while. So being able to actually see what's happening gives you a better idea of what you need to change. Of course, the way malware behaves can vary. One of the concerns, of course, is what's the impact going to be if we have malware that is running that is in fact getting to the IBMI. Of course, there's a delete. There actually have been numerous documented cases of malware that actually deletes files. That's the payload. Delete the files, be destructive. And it's unfortunate, but if you've got a user with a connection through the file server or you've got that share and you've got that user that has access or the threat actor who has access, it's quite simple to actually be able to delete large quantities of files on your IBMI. Keeping in mind, you've got the integrated file system under that is that qsys.lib. So if you in fact have an outbreak of malware that is in fact looking for a payload to delete all of your files, it is possible to happen. Colleague that works for another services group, he actually took it upon himself to prove this out, and he took him a few days, but he was able to literally destroy an IBMI through a map drive to the root with an all object profile. So this is definitely something that you don't want to have to clean up from. You've also got the concern around ODBC and being able to send SQL statements that include commands. Now, on my example here, it's simply sending a message to the QSys Opera message queue with the word boo. However, it could just as easily be a command that is more destructive, whether it's a delete object or if it's an end subsystem or starting a subsystem or starting a type of job that could in fact cause issues. You definitely want to be concerned about that. There's also the concern with shared files being modified or deleted or encrypted. And if a file is encrypted, it's essentially unavailable unless you have the key to decrypt it. So with the ability to connect to the IFS through that file server and having the authority, you can easily find that files can be modified. And once they're modified, they may not work, your applications may not work, your user interfaces may not work as expected. Or if they're completely gone, then of course applications are going to start failing as well. So making sure that you are not ending up with those files being damaged or modified or encrypted is definitely crucial. Another concern is denial of service attacks. And so, IBMI unfortunately can be vulnerable to that just as easily as any other server. Especially if you're hosting that web server, it could easily be overwhelmed. IBM does include an option that allows you to, in fact, mitigate denial of service attacks. And another thing to consider is if your users are all using ACS or the green screen, you might want to consider when a user profile exceeds the number of invalid sign-in attempts, don't actually disable that workstation. If you have assigned workstations, you're all right. But if they're generated on the fly. You could essentially run out of workstations if somebody is in fact doing an attack through Telnet. Now, here's an example of one company's very unfortunate experience I worked with a few years ago with the worst case scenario, the map drive to the root directory, all object user, and ransomware attack starting on a Friday afternoon. And by the time they discovered the attack, it had actually encrypted 500,000 files on that IBMI through that root directory and had dropped over almost 250,000 copies of itself out onto their system. Now, the way that ransomware has evolved over time is that it actually no longer drops copies of itself onto a server. The idea here is that the threat actors don't want to be discovered quickly. And so by dropping copies of itself, ransomware does in fact get discovered pretty rapidly. So you're not going to see this as much. This is not something that's going to be as easy to identify with that ransomware being dropped on your server. So there's a couple of things that you'll need to do with that, and I'll mention those here shortly. But whether it's a big attack like this one or a smaller attack, regardless, I don't think any company is comfortable with, nor should they be, hosting malware on their servers of record. Now, mentioned that ransomware not dropping copies of itself. The background here, there's a customer with a root directory that actually ended up with a 9-ton ransomware, and it was their development server. It took them quite some time. It was a matter of a week to discover, in fact, that their entire development server had in fact been attacked and everything was encrypted on it. So, not paying attention to what's happening on these servers can actually lead to more damage. Another customer that had actually had a ransomware attack that happened about 5 years before I talked with them. And when we ran a scan on their system, we discovered this additional ransomware. And they said, oh, well, this has actually we knew about this. This was from 5 years ago. And we looked at the attributes on the stream files. And as a matter of fact, yes, that file had been on the system since 2017, but somebody had tried to access it just months before that. So whether or not that malware is old or new, the fact that it's on your server, and if anybody is trying to access it, it can become a problem again. Think about this. If you have an old PC that's sitting in the warehouse, sitting in the mail room, sitting somewhere that you guys forget about, and it doesn't get updated, or it's shared by a lot of users, and somebody's disabled the antivirus on that specific system, it's a potential entry point. All of your PCs in your network don't have to be compromised, only one for there to be a problem. So you have to consider that any threat on your server is a valid and clear threat that needs to be neutralized. Now, we've talked a lot about really the attacks and the impact on the IBMI, but really we have to talk about what's at risk. So the operating system itself is at risk. The operating system, as I've mentioned, is just another directory under qsys.lib. If you do a work link and looked at the root directory, you'll find qsys.lib right there. And with that, depending on how you're doing your shares, if you're sharing root, qsys.lib is available. The operating system itself can be compromised. And once you have that share, again, being able to look at that directory through a simple command prompt and actually be able to see your operating system completely out of context could be extremely damaging. Another thing that's at risk through the integrated file system, or the IFS, is your TCP/IP configuration files. We don't think about this, but TCP/IP configuration files are stored and available through that qsys.lib directory. So the fact that if you come under attack and you've shared that root directory, you may not be able to communicate with your system. Your system may not be able to communicate, or it could be modified so that what you think is communicating to the correct place is no longer communicating to the correct place. So this host file right here, I updated my host table entries the other day. And so you can see on my system, recent change date. If you've got that root directory shared, there is a potential that those files can be compromised, modified, damaged, and that could definitely create some system unavailability. Of course, all of the other things that we've talked about are at risk as well. HTTP servers, your web servers could be compromised in an attack. They're highly at risk. MQ series, your 5250 applications, host servers, any third-party applications could be damaged as well. Of course, we have to consider how it could be at risk. So how is it possible that this is going to be at risk? Laptops, web browsing, internet downloads. You know, I was talking about the PC in the back mail room or on the warehouse floor that never gets updated. That causes the system to be at risk, especially if you have done some of those high-risk activities, such as creating shares over too much of the system. VPN connections. I know a lot of companies I talk to, a lot of their users have continued to be remote employees. So you've got a remote employee connecting through a VPN connection. You've lost purview of what they're doing off hours. You no longer know that this PC is sitting in your building and you know what's happening with it. Do you know what they're doing after hours? Whether that's good or bad, there's a potential that it has now exposed your environment, your network, to some malware. Of course, thumb drives, cell phones, MP3 players. Got people in the office that all have smart devices that connect to the network. Those are also going to put it all at risk. Now, when we're talking about why you should be concerned about it, there's actually regulatory concerns involved as well. PCI data security standard. So requirement 5 says that all servers in your network have to have active and up-to-date virus protection. So making sure that every server is in fact going to be protected. A lot of people don't think about that. Really, do we need to protect IBMI from viruses? I think that I've shown that in fact it is a real and anticipated threat. So making sure that you have in fact met those requirements so that you don't get hit in an audit. Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So looking at the protection of non-public personal information. The requirement there is to maintain confidentiality of customer records and information, to protect it against anticipated threats or hazards. So when there is a ransomware attack, I will tell you that they're no longer just attacking the files and holding them for the ransom. They're exfiltrating the data first and threatening to expose it. So it's actually more of extortionware. And the ability for them to gain that information, especially when you're dealing with confidential information and having it exposed, is a huge concern. And again, I think I've demonstrated that it is an anticipated threat to the security of that data. And of course, you're required to protect against unauthorized access to those records and to make sure that it does not cause substantial harm or inconvenience to a customer. If your system is being held for ransom by ransomware, that could very well cause inconvenience to a customer. So you have to think about this in much bigger terms. How is this going to impact our business, but how does it impact our customers as well? HIPAA, of course, is got some pretty tight standards, security standards as well. Making sure that the data is the availability of that electronic protected health information, that EPHI, that it is available and that you are protecting that data against reasonably anticipated threats, and that you have taken measures to sufficiently reduce the risk of something happening to that data. So again, anticipated threats and hazards to the data, it's critical to be able to protect that. Of course, one of the things we talk about too is auditing. So having the ability to show what's happening on the system and be able to actually show auditors what is happening. Or maybe it's an internal audit. You may not fall under some of these regulatory compliance requirements. It could be that you are doing your best for your customers because it's the right thing to do as a business. So being able to audit activity on the system, when we're talking about the IFS, it is similar to the auditing of IBMI objects, and you can audit specific events. So first you have to make sure that the QAud control system value actually has object odd set so that you can actually begin that object auditing. And then you can use the change odd command to specify what level of auditing for each object or directory that you want to deploy. Now, another way to actually get some better information about IFS events is to deploy those exit programs. The object auditing, it doesn't work for everything in the IFS, and you're not going to really be able to see what happened. So the exit programs, when you have users coming in through anything but the green screen, exit programs are going to get you that best audit information so that you know exactly what happened and who did it. Think back to my screenshot of seeing a user being rejected from accessing a specific directory. When we're auditing the IFS, similar to libraries, each directory is going to have a create object auditing value. So the directory itself is going to have this value set, and it will can control the default for the contents of those directories. So as new files are added to your IFS directory, that create object auditing value is going to determine whether or not the object itself, that new file, isn't going to be audited or not. So you'll need audit special authority or all object special authority in order to see the audit settings on those folders and files. But there are a couple of different options for that create object auditing. You can set to sysval, where it will look to the system value itself to see whether or not those new objects in the directory should be audited. User profile will look to user profile to figure out if it is supposed to audit that activity against that particular object. If the object is changed, then it will determine whether or not it'll only audit if the object is changed. All will actually audit all activity, and of course none does nothing. So thinking about the folder structure, you have to keep in mind you can't just change the auditing on the object itself. You have to do the folder too. All right, so what do you guys need to do about this? So what I would first is to determine what applications are using the IFS. So really figuring out how are you integrating with the IFS. Exit programs are really going to give you that visibility so that you know which applications are in fact touching the IFS and how they're doing it and what they're doing. Understand how security works on the IFS. As I mentioned, we have numerous webinars that we've done talking about IFS security and giving you more granular information than I have today, but really understanding what you've got so that you can safely implement more security on the system. Definitely need to establish security for those top level folders. So root directory, the home directory, making sure the correct users have the correct access, the public authority is not leaving it wide open. Secure your access to qsys.lib. Absolutely required. If you are sharing the root directory, you need to secure qsys.lib. And there is an authorization list that IBM provides called QPWF server. And that is what is used to control access to qsys.lib if the user's coming through the file server. So making sure that somebody is not able to navigate your operating system from a map drive. Make sure that you're monitoring and protecting those file shares. I cannot drive home enough. Do not share the root directory. I showed you guys a screenshot with a root directory shared. Do as I say, not as I do. Do not share the root directory. You need to make any shares that you do have, where possible, set them to read only so that you don't have the potential of malware spreading to the system. Make sure that you are auditing and alerting on user activity. Whether it is suspicious or not, you should be able to go and see your audit log of what people are doing. If you do see something suspicious, then absolutely act on it. Use an exit program for that. If we're looking for exit programs, I would not do, and actually I just saw a question pop up into the questions panel. I would not try to write your own exit programs. It is very complicated. You can affect performance. It is definitely something that is high maintenance. And unless you have your own full development team that is completely under purview of security, then I would not do that. Look for a commercial solution. Protect your system from viruses. I think this one's obvious, but you'd be amazed at how few realize that you need to actually protect that IFS from viruses. I think I've shown you a lot of examples of why. So taking it seriously, making sure that you are in fact doing native virus scanning, not trying to use a Windows PC to try to scan the IFS. You actually undo all of the security recommendations that I just talked about. Finally, test your security. Don't take for granted that the steps that you've taken are actually going to work. Look for the ability to push the limit, test those settings, consider pen testing. We have a security services team that does some fabulous pen testing to show whether or not they can actually get into your system and get to something important and prove it to yourself that what you've done is going to work in the event of an attack. Lots of homework, lots of things to think about with this. You know, the IFS is, it's not an easy thing to get a grasp on and to be able to get control over, but I guarantee that it is worth the time and effort to actually start paying attention to it. All right, so one of the things you can start with when you're getting going on a security project, such as the IFS or any other security projects on IBMI, is to consider doing a security review. Great place to start. It's Help Systems has written this application. It is provided at no cost to customers, where you'll be able to run a report, looks at 6 areas of security on the system, runs very quickly, makes no changes to your application, does not access application data, and provides you this easy to view report. It includes an expert review, an hour with me or one of my colleagues to be able to walk through and talk about what it found and give you suggestions for remediation so that you really have a place to start rather than, I'm pretty sure I need to secure the system. This gives you this is why you need to secure this system, and here's where you should pay attention to first. So great way to start. As I said, it's no obligation with that, so you're able to get a good top-down view of what's happening on the system. We have customers who come back once a year and rerun their security scans, and even the folks that have spent the biggest amount of time working on security projects, we always find something that they can work on, some tweak that can be made to get that system to a more secure state. All right, one last poll for you guys before I let you go. Actually, on that same topic of the security scan, wondering if in fact you would be interested in doing that. Like I said, it is a non-intrusive, it's easy to run, and you've got that report to keep so that you can actually go back. It can help to buy some support from management to get some traction on those security projects. You're probably thinking, yeah, I know we need to beef up the security on our system. So this is going to give you that backup that says, yes, in fact, we do have a reason to be concerned. This is what our system looks like. So if you're interested, go ahead and you can answer that poll there if you would like to, or maybe if you got more information, we're always happy to talk about it before you commit. Make sure that it in fact is something that aligns with your agenda. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close that poll here. Looks like a fair number of people have responded. Appreciate that. We'll be in touch if in fact you wanted more information and would like to do a scan. Okay, so we are actually rapidly running out of time here. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about security on IBMI. I get really excited and really enjoy being able to share this information with you. If you do have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the questions panel. And because I do not have, I don't think I'm going to have time to get to those today. We will follow up with those questions after the webinar is completed. So really appreciate you joining us today. It's always a pleasure. I hope that you got some good information out of it. I'm sure that you're thinking that I just actually created some more work for you. Well, in fact, I probably did. So take care, and we'll be talking with you soon. Thanks.